From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Hello, welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
Our colleague Noel is on a sensitive operation for IGU. They call me Ben. We're joined with our guest super producer, Dylan the Tennessee Pal Fagan. Most importantly, you are you. You are here. That makes this the stuff they don't want you to know. Now, Matt, as we're rolling into this, we got to say it's something a little different for this evening, because this one is for fans of not just true crime, not just investigations, but mysteries, right?
Oh, yeah. The whole story we're getting into today is a mystery. Every aspect of it is a mystery. And we're going to be speaking with somebody who has created, it's the third season of a show, Ben, that I'm going to call you out, you work on. And I think it's a fantastic show. This specific season deals with a case. The details are so fine. I've been lost in it. I've been immersed in it for the past 48 hours.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I can't escape. And I think I know how our guest feels now after diving into it so deeply.
Right. We are speaking with the world expert on a case that remains unsolved in this modern evening. So that's our cold open. We're going to have a quick word from our sponsors, and we can't wait for you to meet this guy. And we've returned. We are joined with the world-class investigative journalist, a man who never met a rabbit hole that he would not go down. Friends, neighbors, conspiracy realists, lend us your ears and help us welcome the one and only Jon Walczak.
Hey guys. Woo, yeah. Just joining you from the depths of madness with my my post-it notes and my strings and my maps. So an undisclosed location. Glad to be with you guys.
Well, right behind John, I'm seeing a picture of a certain wanted individual. I believe that individual's name is Robert Fisher, who is the subject of this season of Missing, titled Missing in Arizona. Go check it out right now while you're... well, wait until you're done with this and then go subscribe. Do that. But John, could you tell us, who is Robert Fisher? Why are you focusing on this individual for a whole season of Missing?
Yeah, so Missing in Alaska, season 1 was a plane that disappeared. Missing on 9/11, a doctor that vanished in New York the night before 9/11. And season 3 is Missing in Arizona, about Robert Fisher. So Robert Fisher killed his family, blew up their house, and then escaped into the wilderness in Arizona. He abandoned his wife's SUV in the remote forest in the mountains. And for 10 days, they didn't know where he was. There was this manhunt. They found the wife's SUV, the 4Runner, near caves, near an Indian reservation. So the big question is, did Robert Fisher die in the wilderness? Did he escape? There are clues everywhere. And I think what makes it really fascinating to me personally is, obviously it's an unsolved mystery. Part of it is the landscape of the American West. So it's an adventure to go into the mountains, to go hunting for a hermit's cabin, to go spelunking in underground caves, which we do in next week's episode. And I think that that's part of the appeal. The other thing is, because it happened in April 2001, it was right before 9/11. It was before social media. It was before smartphones. And so one of the things that we talk about is we really lack what I call these mono mysteries, these great mysteries that unite us. And there's so few of them these days that we look to the past, and it was almost like you can look at 2001 and the early 2000s as kind of the end of these mysteries. So this is one of the great final mysteries of the pre-digital age.
Yeah. Oh, well put. Also, we've got to point out there is something you said that really, really resonates, at least with me, the idea of mono mystery and the idea of the Great West. Because as we say so often on this show, a lot of times people forget just how wide and wild the interior of the United States is. Before we dive in, I do want to point out that you've worked on this show in concert with our comrade, Paul Mission Control Decant. When you all are exploring this stuff, you're not just, on a browser, on an internet. You guys are out there pounding sand. You're out there actually exploring caverns. Could you tell us, maybe one of the first questions here is the following. Was it easier for people to disappear in this time, in April of 2001?
Yeah, so that's one of the big questions is, well, if Robert Fisher did escape, I think he's alive. I'm clear about that. And I've spoken with most of the investigators. They also think he's alive. So our goal is to find Robert Fisher with this show. And, some of the pushback that we get is, well, how could he remain hidden for 23 years? I think if he disappeared in 2024, maybe not, but in April of 2001, it was just a different time. And so, I mean, I was 12, so I'm rapidly aging, but I was, I have a little bit of memory of that pre 9/11 world. And, I think especially for like Gen Z they've never lived in a world where you could walk up to a gate at an airport, for example. So one of the things with this show that I found really fascinating, I have a book sitting right behind me called Hide Your Assets and Disappear. Hide Your Assets and Disappear. And it was a best-selling book in, I think, 1999, 2000. So, I think it was possible that Robert Fisher got out in the nick of time. I call it kind of the fugitive sweet spot, the fugitive donut hole, where he got lucky and he escaped right before Facebook, right before the iPhone, right before 9/11, and is still on the lam.
Wow. Okay. One of the things we talk about on this show a lot is that someone is presumed innocent until they're found guilty, right? When you've got a missing person like this and there's a stack of evidence against you, that's a weird gray area for me cognitively, right? Because unless it's proven in a court of law that he's guilty, then I kind of have to personally at least keep an open mind to, like, did he actually do this? One of the things you do is you look at that stack of evidence and you go through it with a fine-toothed comb. In your mind, what are the biggest pieces of evidence that say Robert definitely killed his family and escaped?
So, yeah. So one of the things that I do is I'm like you guys, I am a truth-based person. It's fun to look at these things, and sometimes conspiracies play out, and sometimes the police or law enforcement, they kind of want to minimize information because they want to stick to a simple narrative. So I just go wherever the narrative leads me. And as far as Robert Fisher, I think, for example, the police have said for years that there were pour patterns indicating that he used a liquid accelerant to help burn down his house. And one of the things that we looked at is pour patterns as junk science. It doesn't actually prove anything.
Oh, and just for all of us tonight, what is a pour pattern defined as? POUR.
Yeah, thank you. POUR pattern. So it basically, if I were to burn down the house I'm in right now, and you're looking at the rubble and you see patterns where it looks like I dumped gasoline and then walked backward out of the door, it would look like I had dumped a liquid accelerant. And in this instance, because it was something that happened in a weekday, late at night, if there were a liquid accelerant used, it would indicate premeditation, and that kind of starts to give us clues about who actually pulled off this crime, that it wasn't some random person walking by the home. In this case, it's actually junk science. So I looked very critically at, I believe Robert Fisher committed these crimes, but there were people that should have been looked at more closely that weren't. So for example, I look at the neighbors. When I ask everybody who was feuding with the Fishers, everybody said the neighbors. The neighbors were kind of strange, and they said things that the police don't believe. They said things that the police lean on. I spoke to, this episode we just ran this week, a coworker of Robert's who was a very close female friend of his, who told me that there was a heavy rumor he was having an affair with a certain coworker in the 90s, and that her husband at the time would call and leave threatening messages. And I don't think law enforcement ever looked at him. So while I think Robert Fisher committed these crimes, I always keep an open mind and run it down. And then, one of the great hopes is that people hear that and then come forward with other information.
Wow. Oh, man. Ben, I don't want to jump the gun. And John, I don't want to jump the gun, but I wanted to talk about Ashley and her story of the affair, because it's burning in my mind. I just listened to episode 6, and it is one of those, it's an idea that I think is infectious. So it went into my mind, okay, maybe he was having an affair. Maybe there was a jealous husband out there that wanted, bad things to happen to him. And that would be a pretty big suspect in my mind. If you wanted to destroy Robert's life fully, you do what happened, right?
And this is something Matt and I were talking about offline. This was the oh snap moment.
Yeah. Well, just because I didn't know that there was someone out there like that, right? Like a potential nemesis for Robert Fisher. And it just, we haven't even really gotten into the details. You do in great depth in your show, but just how horrifying these deaths were. Maybe just a quick trigger warning. Can we just let people understand what occurred inside the house even before the fire?
Great point. So, trigger warning, disclaimer, everyone, the following conversation will include graphic and accurate descriptions of horrific events. This is your warning. 3, 2, 1. Over to you, John.
Yeah, so 8:42 a.m., April 10th, 2001, the house explodes. It's this little ranch in Scottsdale, Arizona. It is a fireball into the sky. Obviously, nobody's expecting it. Police show up and they find 3 bodies in the wreckage of the house, a wife and 2 kids. And all 3 of them had their throats cut. And Mary, the wife, also was shot in the head one single time with a bullet. And then whoever killed them, whoever set the house to blow up, they basically left the natural gas going from the furnace, set some kind of trigger, which we think probably was a candle. And then maybe a few hours later, the house exploded. So the cops and the firefighters show up, they find these charred bodies, but they realize immediately that something's wrong because they're mostly in fetal positions, like they're sleeping. And in other cases like this, obviously, if there's a fire, you're going to at least try to escape. You're not going to be found in bed. So they immediately know that they're dealing with a triple homicide. And their initial strategy is to not name Robert Fisher a suspect, to kind of hope that he just shows up and says, hey, guys, I was out camping. What happened? And he doesn't show up. So that strategy was controversial and failed. But I understand why they went with it. But one of the fascinating things about this case, and we go into detail, is there is no forensic evidence proving that Robert Fisher committed these crimes. There is a lot of circumstantial evidence. And so you ask, well, why do I think he did it? Well, one of the key small details, and this is why I get so into the weeds, but I also like to give all these details to the audience and let them kind of come to their own conclusions. But one of the small details that really matters is where Mary Fisher's SUV was abandoned. It was a spot in the forest that Robert Fisher and his family were supposed to go camping several days later. It was a spot that he knew well. And so you have to ask yourself, well, let's say it was an external party. They would have had to know somehow that he knew this exact spot. So you could start getting into theories about, oh, maybe somebody took him at gunpoint, and it doesn't make as much sense to me as that he just did it. But I've heard from everybody, including people that really knew the Fishers well, and including from law enforcement, that they've Ashley, for example, who we just spoke to in this last episode, she gave us some important new information. She spoke to me about the idea of a cartel. So it is a spectacle. Like I say it in the show, but you have 3 throats cut. You have a suburban home that explodes. You have a fugitive who vanishes in the wilderness near a caves. It's really, I see it and came to see it as this classic Western, sort of this neo-Gothic Western story that takes place in 2001 in Arizona against this very harsh landscape, not of the desert, but of the high country in the mountains of Arizona.
And with that, we're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back for more with John.
And we've returned. With this, there's something that I think is on a lot of people's minds with cases like this, right, that occur in, how did you put it, the donut hole, right, of the possibility of disappearance. One of the things that continually stands out in cases like this is always going to be the function of law enforcement, which I know is a sensitive topic. However, given the resources available at the time for the investigators, do you think it is possible that they maybe missed some aspects of the investigation, to Matt's earlier point, for instance, about people worth looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that for a fact because we found those people. So that is, I love the investigative part of this. That is really my passion. The writing can be painful, and the audio and the storytelling are fun, but I love investigating. And I really, really, really get heavily into the investigation, and so does our team. Ben's been involved in that, and Paul Deckant was involved in that as well. And so for example, we find 2 new witnesses who change the timeline of the case, who see Mary Fisher's SUV after what we've been told for 23 years is the final sighting. That really matters because it means there was a much shorter window during which Robert Fisher could have disappeared. We find forensic experts that haven't spoken before, at least the press. We found witnesses and family friends and coworkers who haven't spoken to even law enforcement. So I find it fascinating about these cases. This is a high-profile case. Robert Fisher was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list for 19 years. When I come onto a case like this, I wonder, well, why am I doing this? Why am I investigating this? Obviously, the FBI and the police must have found everything, right? Well, the answer is no. And that is why I love doing this, because it's exhausting, but then the 1 out of 99 people, they actually have new information that you've never heard before. So we speak to those people throughout the show. And even as we work toward an ending for the show, and I'm clear we haven't found Robert Fisher yet. I really want to find him, and that is a big hope of mine with the audience that we're getting, that we find Robert Fisher. But throughout the show, you're going to hear from new people, and I know law enforcement is listening to the show as well, and they are learning about people because I'm in contact with those folks, and they've never spoken to the cops or the FBI before. So my hope is I have an interesting relationship with law enforcement. I really, really respect some of them. Some of these guys really care about this case. Bob Caldwell, FBI, Hugh Lockerbie, Scottsdale, TJ Duran, Scottsdale, very smart, capable guys who care. And then I also am clear, like, I get to just focus on this full time. But if they really want to solve this, and I believe they do, there are certain things that I think they can do that I kind of want to light a fire to push them to do. So I lay out, well, what can be done forensically? So, for example, as of last summer, they had not used like open source, like GEDmatch, like DNA databases to say, well, one thing that I speak to experts on familicide and domestic violence, they say if Fisher did escape, he could have another family at this point. He could have adult children. So what if one of their adult kids uploaded their DNA and wanted to learn about their ancestry? And then it's like, okay, well, that seems kind of far-fetched, but one of the things that I talked to the law enforcement about that as of last summer they had not done is to look at open source DNA databases like GEDmatch to say, well, Robert Fisher could have a new family. And if he does, maybe he has a kid who uploaded their DNA and wants to learn about their ancestry. And then it's like, okay, well, this is a little weird. I didn't know I had family members in Arizona. So I think, 23 years later, it is still possible to solve this case. There are forensic things that law enforcement can do. I wish I could do them. Sometimes I try to do them, and I fail occasionally. But one of my goals is to kind of walk this line with law enforcement of respect for the work that they've done, but also to kind of light a fire and say, my allegiance are to the people involved in this case first and foremost, and they really want to get this thing solved. So. People say, well, is this realistic? Like, this guy's been gone for 23 years, like, let's be real, you're not going to find him. TJ Duran is one of the detectives of the case. He calls this the John List of our generation, and I agree with him. And John List was somebody who killed his family in New Jersey in the early 70s, was on the lam for 18 years, was featured on America's Most Wanted, and then he was living a new life. He had remarried. His wife obviously didn't know who he was. And I think that there are also just other forensic and tech side things that we can do to move the case forward. And I know you guys will probably get into that.
Yeah. This brings us three paths that are mission critical to the show. The technology piece that I think we have to get into that at some point. But to your point about the forensic aspects here, one of the questions that I know a lot of people are having are going to be immediately concerned with the car, right? Isn't a car traceable to some extent? I mean, Matt, what are you thinking through there?
Oh, well, the SUV was recovered. I just listened to the whole segment where it was the veterinary technicians or the vets who like helped capture Blue, which was the family dog, and using donuts, by the way, which were mentioned already in the show. But I've been in my mind, I've been a little focused on the SUV because I just listened to episode 2 again, where you discuss the vehicle shuffle, where there are two vehicles involved. There's a pickup truck, which is owned by Robert, and then an SUV, which is owned by Mary, his wife, it's their cars, right? And on the night that everything went down, there was a witness or several witnesses that like saw those vehicles being moved in and out of the carport, right, or out toward the street, because they lived in a cul-de-sac where if you've got neighbors around a cul-de-sac, they notice that kind of thing sometimes. What my big question about the SUV was, well, there are a couple, but the first one is, did any witnesses actually see Robert in the SUV leaving the house ever, or on the road, or once it got to where it ended up?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are some alleged sightings, and there are some that I kind of buy and many that I don't. It's difficult to evaluate them. There's nobody confirmed who saw Robert in the SUV leaving the house, on the road, or in the woods. So, I mean, it's an excellent question. And getting to what you were talking about, shuffling the vehicles around, is why this kind of investigative work matters, because the two new witnesses that we found, that's the only reason that we know this now, because previously the final sighting of Robert Fisher or Mary Fisher's SUV was on an ATM footage at 10:42 p.m. on the night of April 9th, 2001. And then we pushed the timeline back like 7 hours, I think. And so, one of the things we say is that night there was this game of, I call it musical cars. And the question is why? You'll listen to the show, but it's like in, out, driveway in, street in, driveway out. And it's like, this was a little bizarre. And why was this going on? And also one of the things that I really heavily am going to focus on as the show goes on is whether somebody helped Robert Fisher. And if instead of only focusing on Robert Fisher, if we start to focus on suspected accomplices who helped him before, during, or after, if we can help bring this case to a close.
Wow. So I'll just tell you where my mind went, because I listened in a weird order. I listened through 1 through 6 in order, and then I went back. And after hearing episode 6, Ashley, now in my mind, I'm almost reevaluating everything in the mind of, well, what if there was somebody, like a third party that was not a part of the family at all, that was maybe an enemy of Robert? What if that person was doing all these actions that we're seeing, and we have witnesses seeing things and evidence of? And in my mind, I went through this whole list of, if I just, and this is horrible to say this out loud, but I am thinking this way. If I just murdered this family of this guy I hate, and him, I murdered him as well, like somewhere, at some point in that time, I wouldn't take a pickup truck with an open bed with a body in it or something. I would put evidence and everything that I had in this SUV that's covered, that police officers wouldn't see in the chance that I passed one. And I would try and make it look like that SUV got driven to a place where this guy would have gone. And now he's just missing. And now he gets blamed for everything, and his whole life is destroyed. And I just keep thinking about all these little pieces of evidence. And I know it's conspiratorial, John. That's just like wackadoo out there. And I don't mean to introduce that necessarily, other than all the information that you're finding is like painting kind of a weird picture in my mind.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything wrong with looking at the conspiracies. Like I love looking at the conspiracies. Like I like your guys' approach because you look at the conspiracies, but you also look at facts. And I think that there's this blindness on the part of people who are only logic. Like you need to look outside the box. Like a huge theme that we've had in all 3 seasons is Occam's razor, which is there's a reason that we're spending years on these particular cases. Because yeah, Occam's razor 99% of the time, but there are times where it doesn't work. It doesn't always work. And so this is a case too where no, it's really smart to look at the alternative answers. And I think that the media and law enforcement in this case had blinders on. And even if you come to the conclusion that you still think Robert Fisher did it, there certainly were other people that they should have looked at that in different circumstances they did not look at very closely. The neighbors, for example, I cite them in the show. The aggrieved husband of somebody who Robert Fisher was allegedly having an affair with. To my knowledge, law enforcement wasn't even aware of that until our show. So, you go through that, you look at it, you say, there is doubt, like, let's not just paper it over for a convenient narrative, for the cops and for the media. And let's look at that stuff. And at the end of the day, if we still think Fisher did it, great, but it's absolutely worth looking at.
Absolutely. And that's one thing here. There's not a stone unturned, not a cavern unexplored, right?
Well, I'm just the caverns in this thing, if you wanted to hide a body also.
So with this, I completely agree with you guys, the concept of the exploration, right? Again, the idea that no lead, no information, regardless of how potentially tenuous, should be in that realm of binders or blinders, right? So you have this wide scope and then you narrow into these specifics, and you have again been on the ground and under the ground, looking for these things that law enforcement does appear to have missed for one reason or another, quite possibly, if we're being honest, resources, and the need to move with other cases in Scottsdale and abroad. One axiom, though, that stands out in this exploration is that through your research, Jon, you have become increasingly convinced that Robert Fisher successfully committed what we call pseudocide, perhaps, or on the edge of pseudocide, has disappeared, and you believe the man is alive. And we see this in the show from the jump. So could you tell us just a little bit about why, like Matt, you gave this, I think, very well thought out what if on this one. And it's one that a lot of our audience and a lot of the audience of Missing is immediately going to understand, because it is possible. So what to you, just in a general way, like, was there a moment when you were looking in this case and you said, no, this guy is alive?
Yeah. So just to circle back to the Forerunner, Matt, the interesting thing about the Forerunner is how clean it was. So they found it in the forest. All the windows were rolled down. It was so clean, like no mud or dirt, a little bit of dirt, but not a ton. I've been up there in dry weather, and definitely in wet weather. Your car is filthy. Right. It was so incredibly clean. And then they processed the car, and they did find some evidence. It's been erroneously reported that they did not find any. So, for example, they found fingerprints. And those fingerprints, I actually speak to a person of interest later in the show, and I would really like law enforcement to check that person's fingerprints. But and then so basically, getting now to Ben's question, why do I think Robert Fisher is alive? Well,
also could you talk about the dog? I hate to be a sucker, but I'm such a fan of animals. If we get to,
well, Ben knows this, but in season 2, Missing on 9/11. The person whose disappearance we were investigating, her cats were in her apartment when the World Trade Center fell. And the number one question I got the entire show, which I didn't even think about at first, was like, are the cats okay?
Yeah.
So I learned to definitely tell people what happened with the pets. So that's kind of a fun, colorful, happy, little, very brief moments of happiness in this show. Not many, but we take them. So when they found the Forerunner abandoned in the woods, they found the Fisher's dog, Blue, Australian cattle dog. And one of the big questions is, if Robert Fisher went into the wilderness and died by suicide, for example, why would Blue stay with the vehicle and not follow Robert? And I speak to the veterinarian they called in, and she was just like a normal morning at her little office, and they sent her into the woods alone with like some donuts to capture this dog. And she and her friend, Patty Blackmore and Samantha Wright, they're hilarious, wonderful people. But the dog was rescued, but no blood on the dog. Where was the dog during the murders? And the dog was missing its collar. And spoiler alert, close your ears if you're listening to the show, but we believe that we tracked down the dog's collar and we flagged that to law enforcement. So even 23 years later, there's a possibility that because of our show, that they have a new piece of forensic evidence that they can process for things like blood stains or DNA. As to why I think Robert Fisher escaped, I don't have a succinct answer. It's something that I'm going to make in multiple episodes. But overall, this is what I think. I think Robert Fisher was a smart guy. He was not stupid. He had experience. He was in the Navy, worked with aviation fuel. He was a firefighter, an EMT. He worked in hospitals. He was good under pressure. In my personal opinion, and it's something I've discussed privately with law enforcement, he basically had this plan where his family was starting to crumble. His wife seemed like she was about to leave him. And he basically plotted out how to escape. So he went to an ATM. It's the final time that we thought that we saw him, though we know that's not true now. And he was wearing, for example, a black ball cap. Even in 2001, if you're going to the ATM, you're going to be on camera. When they found the SUV abandoned in the woods, they found none of the belongings he took from his home, none of the camping gear, not his gun, absolutely nothing. The only two things they found, the dog and the hat. The hat that he was wearing in the ATM footage, which was I spoke to the cop who was the very first person to reach the SUV. It was carefully placed on the side of the passenger seat. So to me, it was almost like a calling card of I was here. And then where he abandoned the SUV is also fascinating. We have a brilliant researcher on our team who was originally a fan of Missing in Alaska, Paul Gemperlein, who we brought on as a member of our team this season. And with his help, we pinpointed down to the exact spot in the woods where the Forerunner was abandoned. So I've stood up against the actual tree in the woods in Arizona where the SUV was abandoned. One thing we did with that is we metal detected around that area. I won't spoil that, but we went into the caves. But that spot, if you wanted to pick a spot that was frustrating for law enforcement, it was like 900 feet from an Indian reservation. And the importance of that is because there's tribal land. Outside law enforcement can't just go on. It creates a jurisdiction issue. He put it 150 feet from the closest cave. I've been into that cave. When you're standing in the entrance, you can see where the car was parked. We parked our Subaru Crosstrek kind of close to the size of what they were driving. So if you wanted to make this as frustrating and annoying and difficult as possible for law enforcement, that's what you would do. Something else we look at, Robert Fisher had very serious back pain, enough so that at points it was crippling. He seemed to be addicted to opioids. So there's just this issue of people think maybe he went into a cave. Well, did he go into a cave with severe back problems, a possible opioid addiction, carrying hundreds of pounds of equipment, and no sign of his remains or belongings have ever been found? It starts to seem a little fishy to me. And then that circles back to, do we think somebody helps Robert Fisher? I think somebody helped him. So then you're looking at, well, did he have any connections to the drug world? Was he having an affair? Did he have any kind of shady friends? And I think those are questions that we look at later in the show. But long story short, I think Fisher's alive, and I really, really want to find him.
We're going to pause for a word from our sponsor, and then we'll return with more from Jon Walczak.
And we're back. Let's get into it. So I'm trying to imagine, let's say you take that SUV to that place where it's found, right? It's pretty much clean, but we know it was filled with stuff because stuff was missing from the house, right? Where do we think that stuff went? Just, was it enough stuff that he could carry on his person, or was it one of those things where there needed to be another vehicle where it got loaded into, or, I don't know. Just what do you think there?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important clue, because the two main theories are that Robert Fisher died by suicide in the wild, or that somebody helped him escape. And maybe throw in a suicide trigger warning here, but if you're going to die by suicide in the wild, it's a beautiful area out there. It's unfortunately not uncommon in that general area. It's something that law enforcement told me. But you're not necessarily going to take all of your hundreds of pounds or 100 or 200 pounds of equipment. You might just walk up to a hill. So I think that he left the cap that he was wearing in the ATM footage as, yes, this was me. You have me on camera. Now this cap, which has my DNA on it, is in the car. Nothing else is here. And now I'm going to park the vehicle in a very difficult spot where you're going to have to navigate caves, tribal land, the wilderness. And so I think that is a big clue. Personally, I think he took his stuff with him.
Wow. Just like picked it up and went somewhere.
Well, and real quick, I mean, also that could still be something that helps us solve this today, because one thing I found, for example, is he took a 38 revolver, and we know the serial number of that 38. So that's something I say in the show. If you have a snub nose 38, please look at the serial number. So kind of like the DB Cooper cache, like you don't think it's ever going to be found, and then some little kid is digging on a sandbank. Like we can hope. You
never know. Again, the idea of the wilderness here. One thing that maybe a lot of us listening this evening are not experientially aware of is the fact that there are people who do successfully live off the proverbial grid. There are folks who are simply nomadic in a forest, or have, some kind of hobo jungle or a camp. John, is that something that exists in the area of the wilds of Arizona?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't think Robert Fisher is still living in the wilderness 23 years later, but there's definitely a chance that he did for a time. And I think, one of the things that we look at other cases, right? So Eric Rudolph is the most prominent case, the Olympic Park bomber, who in the late 90s and early 2000s, I mean, he hid out in the mountains of Western North Carolina, my home state, for 5 years, and he managed to evade a massive, massive manhunt. Something that I also just find interesting is getting away from crime. Yeah, absolutely. There are people that do this all over the country. It's something I heard examples of in Alaska. It's something I heard about in Arizona, where even though I'm looking specifically at the Fisher case, that's something that personally fascinates me. So for example, I spoke with members of law enforcement who work in these very rural, is one of those counties on the map that's like a quarter of the country long. And they told me true examples and names of people that as recently as the last few years are living off the grid on public land and in the forest in Arizona. So one of the things that we do in the show is we got a lead about a possible hermit's cabin not that far from where Robert Fisher disappeared. And so we tried to hike to that cabin. It got very rough terrain. But so we know certain things, for example, that wouldn't maybe prove something, but would give us an indication of, let's look at this more closely, like this type of gun. He was very into wintergreen Copenhagen chewing tobacco. So if I found a little shanty in the woods and it was like these dusty old wintergreen tobacco tins, it would kind of raise my blood pressure. But the hermit aspect is really fascinating. And I think that for me, I think, missing in Alaska in particular, and now missing in Arizona, there's this strong wilderness angle where there are few mysteries that are new. There are few spots on the map that are unexplored. That's what we think. But then go put some GPS coordinates into your phone like we did, and you'll see it's pretty rugged and rough. And And, I reference, I say, in a violent nature, like the film.
Oh, yeah. Hey, by the way, when you're finished listening to Missing in Arizona, which you need to go listen to right now, do subscribe to Flashpoint, which is a whole season that we're making with Tenderfoot on Eric Rudolph. And just the point you're making about him and how he was able to just vanish for so long in the wilderness. And he was protected somewhat by individuals that maybe sympathized a bit with him and what they perceived as his cause, which is something to think about here. I don't think that Robert Fisher had a cause, at least that I'm aware of. It doesn't seem like there was any kind of religious or political or any kind of motivations for the actions that were potentially taken there. Is that correct? That's what I'm getting from the show, at least.
Yeah, so Robert Fisher, I mean, kind of a right-leaning guy, but this was definitely not motivated by politics. And then you touched on something really important there, talking again about Eric Rudolph, which is, Rudolph had far-right ideologues who supported him. So he had help over the years and people that could have turned him in who didn't. Nobody's supporting someone who killed their wife and children.
Yeah.
There's not an ideology that, no matter we're left, right, whatever, political ideology, there's no support for that. That is, he committed, I think in a different case, if he had robbed a bank or something, he'd be a folk hero. And to some people, even Eric Rudolph was, though obviously I disagree with that. But
thank you. Yeah, good to know.
just to clarify, guys.
Yeah, just to get in front of that one, John.
Yeah, in my teens in North Carolina, when he disappeared, I wasn't out there giving him wheat or rice. Or,
right.
That show, just to interrupt really quickly, that show is hosted by, this is a spoiler, is hosted by a child who would have been aborted by his mother if Eric Rudolph hadn't bombed the abortion clinic the morning of the appointment, which is a crazy conundrum that, in that host's mind and in all of our minds, you have to work through. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean, the Rudolph case is fascinating. And I mean, I grew up in North Carolina, went to college in Asheville, North Carolina. And I think he was caught in Murphy maybe a year before I went to school. So
wow.
I was very, very they got him before, but I used to go hiking and camping. But there's also this dark romanticism of the wilderness, a fugitive. And with Rudolph, it's a little bit more political. With Fisher, what's really interesting about this case, I think, is in some ways, this is an extremely rare case. It's a man who is a family annihilator who successfully escaped. And I say it in the show, we might not know his ultimate fate right now, but he did successfully escape. That is extremely rare in these cases, very few cases like this. So I think, one of the things we do everything from speak to experts to go into spider-filled caverns, but we can learn from experts who study familicide and family annihilations. And so I one of the fun parts of this job, and you guys obviously know it, is you get to speak to experts about fascinating topics. And so in some ways, Robert Fisher is extremely rare and unique, and in other ways, he's not. And what I mean by that is there are patterns that typically lead towards these types of crimes. There are different ways to classify family annihilators. And in the sense that Robert Fisher's family was breaking down and he was spiraling and losing control, I say it and verbalize it. Ben's heard me say this: control. That's Robert Fisher. He started to lose control. And something I tie into is, I know there are people out there who are possibly dealing with abusive situations or situations that are not safe. And one important thing about many of these men who commit family annihilations is they do not have a history or a pattern of physical domestic violence. So our idea of the stereotypical wife beater or abuser doesn't necessarily fit these guys. Many of them are, quote, respectable. Robert Fisher was a church-going guy who worked at the Mayo Clinic Hospital and had no known history of physical domestic violence. So
there's a point here that I think you've nailed with great articulation, which is the idea that patterns and predictive kind of analysis only take you so far, because even in the most depraved cases of criminal behavior, even when the perpetrators do not think of themselves as human, they are ultimately human and therefore beholden to certain constraints, right? So we can get we can get a rough idea for some things, but to your beautifully put point there, this stuff can happen somewhere else. And what makes this case rare is, without sounding emotionless, what makes this rare is not that it occurred. What makes it rare is that the suspected perpetrator has disappeared. And this brings us to something that you are able to do that has not been done in many other cases. You are, this is a light spoiler for everybody listening, you are also leveraging technology in an innovative way to not only give us an idea of what Fisher may look like if alive now, but also just an exploration that I would of artificial intelligence and voice modeling that I would argue also at times goes a little past just the mission of the show. We're talking about a lot of things. Could you, I know I'm throwing a lot at you there, Jon, could you speak a little bit about why you and your team chose to leverage technology in this way and what inspired you to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are always things that we can do that are not easy or even sometimes possible for law enforcement to do. We're not constrained the way that they are, and we're not bureaucratic the way that they are. So the first thing that we did is I worked with 3 different forensic artists on new age-progressed images of Robert Fisher. So one of the things, every single person who knew Robert Fisher, I asked, do you have any photos or video of him? Because people ask, well, why did he blow up the house? And the answer is always to destroy evidence. I agree with that, but not in the way people are probably thinking. The bodies were not destroyed. That evidence was there. He must have had some ideas, military experience hospital, that wasn't going to fully work. I think partially it could have been maybe just something, an emotional outburst. But if you're looking at evidence, it was pre-smartphone and at the dawn of digital cameras. So we only have so many photos and so many videos of Robert Fisher. I worked on this for 2 years and I found fewer than 30, to give you an example. So I asked every single person that knew Robert Fisher, do you have photos? Do you have videos? And we got some excellent new photos of him that I purposely am not publishing because I'm using them privately for investigative reasons. They show new angles of his face, for example. And so we worked with 3 forensic artists at the same time, without telling them. It was an experiment. And we gave them the same material because I wanted to see all these 3 talented people, what do they come up with when given the same source material? And then what we did with that is the best one, in my opinion. We put on our show art. So for people right now, if they're on their phones, if you look at the Missing in Arizona show art, that is an age-progressed image of Robert Fisher done by a very talented forensic artist named Michael W. Streed, who we worked with previously. The goal being turn our show art, which is going to be the most visible part of this show visually, into a mini wanted poster. So anybody who sees that, and that gets to the voice. So we were able to take home videos of Robert Fisher that survived the fire. When the house exploded, there was a fire safe, and there were 6 tapes, VHS tapes in there, crackly audio and video from the 80s and 90s. I went through last year and indexed every single second of Robert Fisher's voice. I have like 2,000 entries of like 1 second where you hear him speaking. This is where we get to the crazy, the Carrie Matheson, the maps and stuff. So we took that, and then I think, we recreated Robert Fisher's voice using artificial intelligence. We partnered with a company called Altered AI out of the UK. They typically work on projects like Hollywood projects. So, for example, they recreated the voice of a young Michael Jordan, and we partnered with them, and we recreated Robert Fisher's voice. I think when you first hear it, it's a little jarring because it's lower quality. This was extremely tough for us to do because we're so used to it now. We have high quality, high res versions of, all of us, Matt, Ben, me, our voices out there. So we can make each other say whatever we want, right? Or my brother sends me videos of Johnny Cash singing hip hop songs, or, that's the fun side of it. But with Robert Fisher, we had about 10 minutes of source audio, and it was horrible. It was from crackly home videos that mostly survived in a fire safe in an exploded house. So what Altered AI was able to do is create a custom voice model for us. And we, later on in the show, it hasn't aired yet, I interview an AI Robert Fisher, which is a very fine ethical line to walk. So it's tough because like I'm scripting this, like, so it's, you know, in my head of, man, okay, so I got to be careful, right? Like legally, I've got to be careful. Ethically, I've got to be careful. Obviously, I still want it to be interesting. So
but you're upfront about it, right? I'm
upfront about it. Yeah. Like I'm not going to have Robert Fisher say certain things like I killed everybody. Like, you know, but it's because this is cutting edge technology. You know, we were able to take horrible source audio and still do this. And the goal here is, you know, people have heard it in the trailer, only a tiny snippet of it right now. We haven't played the full thing. And the goal when you speak to visual forensic artists, what they tell you and what they told me is we're not trying to do a piece of art that's going to hang in somebody's house, though behind me it is actually hanging over my shoulder. What they say is we want to do something that sparks familiarity because we're trying to capture this guy. So we don't want to say this is exactly what he looks like because we don't know exactly what he looks like. We want you to look at this, the show art, the forensic image, and say, man, that kind of looks like my neighbor. That kind of looks like my uncle or my father or my, God forbid, my husband. And we're starting to get those leads already. And people are sending us pictures, and it's interesting because we're looking at those internally. And also, I know people are contacting the FBI as well. But with the voice, what's really interesting is what I want people to understand is that we're not saying this is exactly what Robert Fisher sounds like in 2024. We're saying if this sparks some familiarity, if you see this image and say, that kind of looks like this guy, if you hear the voice and say, okay, well, kind of 80s, 90s quality, but that kind of sounds like him a little bit too, then maybe you'll do a double take and look closely at people. And we are legitimately using and leveraging and trying to use this show to find this guy. So that is, if we find this guy, it's going to be because of the audience. It's the same thing that happened with John List. It was an audience member. It was a woman in Colorado in her apartment watching America's Most Wanted who said, I think that kind of looks like our neighbor, Bob. And I think her kids were like, yes, mom, like, sure. Like, like, yeah, that's Bob the neighbor. All right. And it was John List, and this lady caught John List.
That's so crazy. That's so crazy. The forensic DNA thing, I think, is so great. We talked a lot about, what was it, the original Night Stalker that got caught, and
D'Angelo, yeah,
and just a bunch of other people that we've covered on our show that ended up getting caught because officers waited for whoever to have a finished can in the trash can, took it, and then now they found you. But it was through finding like a long lost cousin or a distant relative via those things like GEDmatch. Man, what you're doing with the AI stuff is so fascinating. I remember when I first saw the cover art, I was like, oh, wow, that's crazy. And I asked Ben about it, and he's like, oh, that's actually, you know, this is like what he would look like potentially. I'm like, what? No.
I love how it sounds like, Matt, I love how it sounds like we're hanging out in a college dorm room, which is kind of like how our conversations go. Like, yeah, bro, this is like what he would look like.
I'm sorry, we're not high in the, you know, in the quad or whatever that is. May go to Home Depot. I don't know if we'll have time. Sorry, just shout out to one of my favorite Will Ferrell movies. Okay,
this is how we talk to each other, though. Just so you know.
That stuff's so awesome. One thing that I really appreciate about this show is something we've talked about a couple times already. You don't just take for granted what has been written in a publication, like a local newspaper states something early on in the investigation that ends up not being the truth. But a layperson or me or just whoever else that's coming to this story way after the fact might look at that and say, oh, well, it says here, you know, in 2001 that this happened. And you just take that as a fact. Speaking again about myself and anybody else who might be just a third-party observer of what happened or researching for their own purposes or on the surface. I really appreciate that you dig into that. You actually go to the investigator. You actually go to the human beings that were there and you verify stuff. Just really appreciate it. And just want to say thanks for doing what you do. And please keep doing stuff like that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I think that, because this is an ongoing investigation, we're not just telling a story, we're trying to add to it and solve it. And because of that, we need to have all the facts correct. So, quite often I say it, but there are early erroneous reports that are later corrected, but they live on, and these stories become myth. And so you have a lot of people, sometimes even second or third generation law enforcement, that they're getting these bits and pieces that are not accurate. And that is really hampering any movement on the case. So, we dig into myths, and we look at everything and reevaluate it and make sure that, even for our audience, like that they have the facts so that if they want to try to help with this, and for the last 3 seasons, we have had a lot of actually wonderful help, that they have everything correct. And I know I ruffle some feathers, but truly my fidelity is to the show, is to the story. And that's just me. I nerd out on that stuff, and the truth matters to me. Crediting regional and local journalists matters to me.
Mm-hmm.
And
same here.
Yeah. As Ben is saying, it matters to us a great deal too. And it is just sometimes difficult, I think, when you're in this sea of all of these links and all of the people now who write about stuff, right? And there's so much commenting, there's so many threads on every subject. It's so difficult to sift through all that stuff to get to what is likely the closest thing to the truth. And there is a bit of faith in there every time. You're like, I'm pretty sure when that person wrote that down, they could verify it. I hope. It's tough.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely tough. And I mean, you look at the press reports, and sometimes there are even conflicting reports like in the same publication. So I think a lot of it is just being able to evaluate information, kind of to use your best judgment to determine what's accurate. And if there's anything that's really important or sensitive, to follow up on it and and dig in on it, especially when, for example, one thing that we mentioned is the idea that there were footprints leading to the cave and no return tracks. So if you hear that and it's something that's been repeated for the last 23 years, you're understandably going to think, well, Robert Fisher died in a cave because they found footprints going to the cave. Mm-hmm. And why are we even bothering with this show or this investigation? Why am I looking for him? He's clearly dead in a cave, guys. But then when you dig into it and you say, okay, well, that seems like such a small detail, right? Like some footprints. But there's so many people I've talked to who say something like that. And then you look at it and you say, that's actually not true. Then that removes that idea from people's head. And I say it in the show, but it opens up their mind to other possibilities, or that they're not shutting down the idea that he escaped immediately, and that people kind of get reinvigorated to help find him.
And I really appreciate that point, John. That's something on a personal level I run into a lot with research myself, and I'm sure Matt feels the same way. This is indicative or illustrative of a great truth that people ignore. History hinges on what may appear to be very small things. And so we must triangulate. We must look into that. And that's something that I think makes our mad endeavor here a kindred spirit with missing. And speaking of following up, one thing we have to say before we go, this is again an active investigation. John is cooking live. There is a possibility to figure out what actually happened to Robert Fisher. And John, you have constructed a way for people to contact you directly about this case. I believe you are still very much open to any new leads or possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. So I tell everybody, look at every single man in your life who wasn't in your life prior to April 2001. Look at them in real life. Look at them on Facebook. Look at them on the street. And
wait, Matt, when did we meet?
Oh, God. 2006.
Okay. Oh, all right.
And look at our show art. And now I'm looking kind of closely at this Ben Bolin character.
Hey. All right, this interview is over.
How old would he be right now?
Yeah. So I don't want to age Ben. So he would Robert Fisher would be 63. Ben is much younger than that. But
Sure
unless he just aged very well. But yeah.
He did.
So I truly want everybody to look at everybody in their lives. I will say we're getting leads, we're getting emails. I personally funded a $10,000 reward to help find Fisher, because when he came off the FBI's 10 most wanted list in 2021, I was shocked to learn $0 available for his capture. So we're doing everything in our power to find him. And I'd encourage people to, the contact info is in the show, but the quickest way to reach us is to go to neon33.com. There's a way you can submit information to us. We take your anonymity very seriously. And Ben has seen this, but one thing that I've found, we're getting leads live, is a certain photo of someone taken in the earlier mid-2000s who, to me personally, we've discussed this internally, strongly resembles Robert Fisher. So this is an active investigation, and people can help just by looking at other people and looking at the age progressed image of him. And we absolutely want people's help. And like I said about the older lady in Colorado with John List, if this is solved, we might bring attention to it, but it's going to be solved by somebody who's out there listening or watching.
You have a number for tips as well, right?
Yeah. So if people want to call in, they can call 1-833-NEW-TIPS. That's NEW TIPS. So it's 1-833-639-8477. They can email us at tips@iheartmedia.com, tips@iheartmedia.com, or they can go to our site at neon33.com. And if they go to our site, one of the things they'll be able to see is a new wanted poster we did with a high resolution age progress image of Fisher.
And with this, we want to thank you, Jon Walczak, investigative host, creator of the Missing series. You can check out Missing in Arizona right now. It is in media res, which is just the fancy way of saying we're in the thick of it right now, in the trenches. As Jon said, we want your help. And while you're at it, while you're up, do also check out Missing in Alaska and Missing on 9/11. Jon, we can't thank you enough for your time here.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. And if you like the show, if you give us 5 stars on Apple, I would be humbly appreciative. But I hope we find Fisher. I hope the next time I talk to you, it's so with a picture of him in handcuffs, or, my dream is he says, I'm not speaking to anybody but Jon, and Ben and I get to go to the jail in Arizona and speak to him. So,
whoa, what if he contacts you and wants you to go to the woods somewhere?
Let's do it. Let's bring a crew. Matt, yeah. What are you doing?
I'm in. Matt, it's your idea, so you're going to be the sacrificial lamb.
I accept. Jon, I'm coming. Let's hang out.
Okay, thanks, guys.
And that is our conversation with Missing in Arizona creator Jon Walczak. Matt, I feel like we went to a lot of places and we still have more to figure out.
Well, now I want to dive into the case with you guys, because I have so many questions and I've got my own pet theories that I kind of want to disprove that I currently cannot. But I'm just going to keep listening, because there are way more episodes than 6, right?
Yes. Yeah, there are more episodes on the way. We can't wait for you to hear them. And one thing that Jon said that I think really resonates with all of us is that it will be you, specifically you, who helps solve this mystery. So reach out to Jon. Tell us your thoughts as well about this case, any similar cases that you may have knowledge of. We try to be easy to find online. We're talking YouTube, the Instagrams, the social medias. You can find us as some derivation of Conspiracy Stuff or Conspiracy Stuff Show at basically any place that has an @ in the front of their handles. And if you don't want to do that, if you prefer to go a little more analog, which we're always fans of, we have a telephone number as well.
Yes, our number is kind of like Jon's, 1-833-STDWYTK. When you call in, it is a voicemail system and you only get 3 minutes. And within that 3 minutes, you need to give yourself a cool nickname. We don't care what it is. We're excited to hear it. And let us know if you give us permission to use your name and voice in one of our listener mail episodes. And hey, if you got more to say that can fit in a message, why not instead send us a good old-fashioned email? We are
The entities that read every piece of correspondence we receive. I don't want to lose the point about listener mail segments and our strange news segments because they do inform episodes. You don't have to feel like you're responding to something that was already on air. If you want to give us a lead, if something crazy is happening in your neck of the global woods, we want to hear it.
Or if you just want to call and just say something silly to us.
Or if you just want to call and say something silly to us, we love the emails. We love the phone calls. Join us over here in the dark. Conspiracy at iHeartRadio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.